Rain always sounds different on the harbor before sunrise. Out on the open water it turns flat and distant, but against the steel shell of my boathouse it comes down like a fistful of bolts. That morning it hit so hard I could feel it through the welding table. My name is Nolan Pierce. I'm 41, and for the last 12 years I've made a living going into buildings after everything goes wrong. Flooded basements, burst pipes, kitchen fires, roofs peeled back by storms, rowhouses full of black water and ruined drywall. Most people look at a damaged room and see loss. I look at it and start sorting: what can dry, what has to go, what can be saved if I move fast enough. That was what I was doing at 5:20 that morning, alone in my workshop with the overhead lights buzzing and a dehumidifier humming near a stack of reclaimed oak doors. I had a church office in Canton waiting on salvage trim, and 3 bins of water-warped records I was trying to flatten before they curled beyond repair. Coffee in a metal mug. Radio off. Storm shutters locked. My usual peace. Then somebody started pounding on the storm door. Not knocking. Pounding. Fast, uneven, desperate enough that I knew right away this wasn't a delivery, and it wasn't a neighbor dropping by with some simple favor. I crossed the shop, stepped around a pile of air scrubber housings, and killed the grinder I'd left idling. When I opened the inner door and looked through the glass, I saw 2 women under the yellow yard light, both soaked through, both carrying bags that looked heavier than they should have been. I knew the older one before I fully placed her. Evelyn Hart. Director of the East Harbor Community Health Center. 37, maybe 38 if I had guessed before. I'd spent 3 weeks at her building that spring repairing water damage from a cracked supply line in one of the counseling rooms. She'd been the kind of person who could answer 3 questions at once, calm down a crying volunteer, and still remember the name of the flooring rep, composed. Sharp. Never still. That version of her wasn't standing outside my door. Her dark hair was wet and stuck to her coat collar. Her face had that drained, overused look people get when they've been carrying too much for too long and finally hit the edge of it. Beside her stood a younger woman I recognized only from seeing her once in passing upstairs at the center. Tessa, her niece, 22 maybe, white-knuckling an overnight bag in a sealed black document case like somebody might try to snatch it. I opened the door. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said immediately, voice rough from cold or from a long night. "I know this is out of nowhere." "You should get inside first," I said. That was enough. They stepped in and the wind shoved a spray of rain in after them before I got the door sealed again. Tessa looked around the workshop like she'd expected an office and found a shipyard instead. "This is where you live?" "Half live, half work," I said. "What happened?" Evelyn set her bag down carefully. "City inspectors closed the building overnight. They called it a contamination emergency." She said the phrase like she didn't believe it. "Because I was in the apartment above the center, they removed me too." Tessa was there helping with records. Before dawn, Tessa cut in. Private contractors came in before the posted order. They locked internal offices, shut off access to 2 admin rooms, and told everyone the whole property was under emergency remediation. She held up a packet of damp paperwork. I took it, glanced at the first page, then the second. By the 3rd line I felt something tighten in me. The formatting was wrong. The sequence was wrong. The notice used broad hazard language, but half the terminology had been lifted from standard mold abatement templates. And if this had been a real high-risk response, nobody would have let them stand in the lobby arguing over bags while unmarked contractors moved through offices. "Who gave you this?" I asked. "A supervisor on site," Evelyn said. "He wouldn't answer anything twice." I read one contractor name again, then looked up. "You can stay here until this weather breaks." Evelyn opened her mouth, probably to refuse on principle. I didn't give her the chance. "I don't have a guest room," I said, already moving. "But I've got space. That's the only way I know to help when things tilt sideways. Not with speeches." With structure. I rolled 2 supply racks away from the east wall, locked their wheels, then pulled waterproof curtain panels from storage and clipped them along a pipe track I'd installed years earlier for spray containment. I added folding partitions to block the sightline from the main work area, set up 2 cots from my disaster trailer, ran an extension line for lamps and chargers, and dragged over a clean rug so they wouldn't wake up on bare concrete. Then I brought extra blankets from the loft and a milk crate to use as a table. It took me less than 20 minutes. When I was done, Tessa stared at the enclosed corner like I'd built a room out of weather and scrap metal. Evelyn stood just outside the curtain, one hand still resting on that black document case. For the first time since she walked in, some of the strain in her face eased. "You do this a lot?" she asked quietly. "Make space when there isn't any?" I said. "Yeah." Outside, the storm kept hammering the harbor. Inside, my controlled, solitary life had already changed shape. And looking at the papers in my hand, I had a feeling this wasn't just 2 people needing shelter from rain. By the second morning, the boathouse had stopped feeling like a place where 2 people were hiding from bad weather and started feeling like a machine running on not enough sleep. I'm used to noise with purpose. Fans drying out subfloors. Pumps cycling in a crawl space. Forklift chains knocking against steel. What I'm not used to is human rhythm inside my own routine. A kettle heating while I'm checking moisture readings. Tessa pacing with a notebook and my spare landline headset, calling legal offices before most people had their first coffee. Evelyn sitting at the workbench near the east wall, answering one calm, measured call after another and sounding like the floor under her wasn't concrete and the room around her wasn't half workshop, half shelter. For 2 days that became our pattern. Tessa worked the phones like she was trying to hold a roof up with bare hands. She built lists, chased contact names, wrote down extension numbers, left messages for aid groups, compliance desks, tenant lawyers, donor offices, and 2 former board members who apparently only answered for people they thought could still help them. Every hour or so she'd look at me and say, "Do you know where the stapler went?" like I ran an office supply warehouse. Evelyn did the harder part. She took calls from staff, from clients, from people who depended on the center for things too important to leave in a locked building. Access files. Support records. Grant binders. Paper trails no one thinks about until somebody bars the door and suddenly every missing folder becomes a person left waiting. She never raised her voice. That was what got to me. I'd seen her in control before, back when I was replacing water-damaged trim at the center. This was different. Her control had edges now. I'd catch her standing by the storm door after a call, one hand pressed flat against the metal frame, eyes shut for maybe 3 seconds before she turned back around and sounded steady again. The public version of Evelyn Hart was polished enough to make people assume she never dropped anything. The version in my boathouse forgot to eat unless Tessa pushed a plate at her. She read every message twice. She kept apologizing for taking up space while barely sleeping at all. I didn't know what to do with that, so I fixed things. A latch on the document case had started sticking from the rain. I took it apart, dried the spring housing, reset the pin, and handed it back without making a production out of it. Later that afternoon Tessa brought me a portable scanner Evelyn had managed to grab on the way out. The hinge was bent, the feed rollers jammed, and one corner looked like somebody had dropped it on concrete. "Can you save it?" Tessa asked. I set it on the bench under the task lamp. "Depends how much patience you've got. I'm staying here with the man who built us a room out of curtains," she said. "I've got patience." Evelyn was on a call 10 feet away, trying to reassure a donor that records were intact, or mostly intact, or at least not formally lost. She kept her voice level, but I could hear the strain in it. I opened the scanner housing, cleaned the track, straightened the bracket, and found one snapped guide tab I could replace with a trimmed nylon shim from my supply bins. 40 minutes later the thing whirred to life. Tessa actually smiled. "That's unsettling." "What is?" "You look happiest when something is half broken." That's because half-broken can still be saved. Evelyn turned at that. Only for a second, but I saw the look in her eyes. Tired. Grateful. Careful. That evening she finally handed me the closure packet and asked what I'd seen the first morning that bothered me. I spread the pages across the work table. This notice borrows language from standard mold work, I said. See here, here, and here. But the crew you described showed up in full chemical response branding. Tessa leaned in. Which means? Means it's theater. Real teams don't mix that kind of language unless they're sloppy or in a hurry. And if this was a real high-level containment event, the sequence would be different. Access logs first. Perimeter control second. Chain of custody on records immediately. Evelyn folded her arms. You're sure? I make my living around bad buildings, I said. Bad buildings still follow patterns. This doesn't. She stared at the paperwork long enough that I could almost hear the thoughts settling into place. That was when the calls started changing. Staff weren't just asking when they could get back in. Donors were asking why medication support files couldn't be retrieved. One counselor needed archived family case notes for an active placement issue. A grant officer wanted access to compliance binders by Friday. Every missing cabinet suddenly had a deadline attached to it. Late that night, after Tessa finally gave up and curled under a blanket with legal pad still beside her, Evelyn stayed at the bench while I packed away tools. There's something I didn't tell you, she said. I waited. The owner of the property has been pushing a redevelopment proposal for months. They want the whole block cleared. Health offices, small housing units, everything. She looked down at her hands. A luxury medical corridor, that's what they call it when they're being polite. And the center said no. I said no. Her voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. We kept finding displacement issues buried under the proposal. People moved without proper support, older residents priced out, service access reduced, promises made in public that didn't match the private drafts. The rain had stopped by then, but I could hear harbor water knocking against the pilings under the floor. Tessa saw something else, she said. As if her name pulled her back awake, Tessa sat up from the cot, hair a mess, eyes still half closed. I saw maintenance workers taking hard drives out of a back office before the order was posted. I thought they were securing equipment. Now I don't think that. I looked from one of them to the other, then back at the pages spread across my table. This wasn't a building problem. It wasn't even just an eviction with better paperwork. Somebody had staged a crisis, pushed Evelyn out fast, and gone straight for the records that mattered. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I was at the main table with Evelyn's closure packet spread under my task light, a pencil in one hand and a cup of dead coffee in the other. Tessa sat cross-legged on one of the cots behind the partition, laptop open, pulling up whatever she'd managed to save before they were pushed out. Evelyn stood at the window facing the harbor, phone in her hand, not calling anyone, just thinking. I went through the paperwork line by line. When you spend enough years inside damaged properties, you stop seeing forms as official just because they carry a seal and 3 signatures. Real emergency work has a sequence to it. Somebody assesses. Somebody documents. Somebody controls entry. Somebody accounts for what gets touched and what gets removed. Even a rushed job leaves a pattern. This packet didn't. The first problem was the contractor license number. It was formatted like a state remediation credential, but 2 digits were off from the sequence Maryland usually used. The second problem was timing. Their order claimed containment had already been established before the full access restriction, which made no sense. You don't seal people out first and then decide what kind of event you're responding to. You classify, then lock down. I circled the sections and pushed the pages toward Evelyn. This doesn't survive scrutiny, I said. She turned from the window. You sound very sure. I am. I tapped the margin with the pencil. Either the team on site was incompetent, or this thing was built to look official from a distance and never expected to be read by somebody who works these scenes. Tessa looked up fast. So we can fight it. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She came to the table, read what I'd marked, then exhaled through her nose like somebody trying not to give hope too much room. It's not that simple, she said. It rarely is. Her eyes shifted to the far side of the room, to the racks, the tools, the stacked air movers, anywhere but me. If I push this into daylight, they won't just defend the closure. They'll come after everything they can use. Delayed audits. Gaps in our reporting. Funding weaknesses. Half the work we do depends on keeping fragile systems moving while pretending they're more stable than they are. Tessa shut her laptop. So what, we let them do this? No. Evelyn's answer came fast, sharper than anything she'd said all morning. Then her voice lowered. I'm saying they know where we're vulnerable. That, more than the paperwork, told me how bad it was. People like Evelyn learn to carry weak points quietly. They keep the mission moving, patch the cracks, buy time, protect everybody downstream. The problem is, once somebody maps those cracks, they know exactly where to press. Tessa turned the laptop toward us. Then maybe we stop thinking like they control the whole board. On the screen were server logs. Not pretty ones either, just raw exported timestamps she'd copied before getting pushed out. User IDs. Access paths. Timestamps from the night before the shutdown. I pulled these before they killed the admin terminals, she said. At first I thought it was regular overnight maintenance. It wasn't. I leaned closer. Several administrative folders had been opened after hours. Not random browsing. Specific directories. Donor compliance. Relocation files. Archive complaints. Zoning correspondence. Whoever was inside the system knew exactly where to go. Evelyn moved beside me. Those records should have required internal approval. Did they have it? I asked. No. Tessa pointed to one entry. This account belonged to a staff machine in the deputy office wing. But the timestamps don't match any scheduled access. I looked at her. You still have the exported file? In 3 places. That almost made me smile. Good. I spent the next 2 hours making calls of my own. Insurance adjusters, one city facilities contact who owed me a favor from a courthouse flood job, an old environmental subcontractor I trusted because he hated shortcuts more than I did. By noon I had a name tied to the cleanup crew. By 1:30 I had a little more. The subcontractor handling the so-called emergency wasn't a real specialist in any meaningful sense. It was a shell outfit. Short history, thin public footprint, mostly tied to rushed demolitions, contested closures, and jobs where ownership changed hands right after the mess was declared too expensive to fix. I set my phone down and looked at Evelyn. This was arranged. She didn't flinch. Maybe because she already knew. Maybe because hearing it out loud made the room feel smaller. Tessa got to her feet. Then we need proof from inside the building. We need to know what they took and what they were looking for. I nodded once. And we need to stop the owner from claiming the center was abandoned. That was when Evelyn's phone buzzed. She checked the message, and I watched the color leave her face. Not dramatically. Just enough to tell me the next thing was worse. What is it? I asked. She handed me the screen. It was a city compliance notice. Formal, cold, written in that polished language institutions use when they want consequences to sound neutral. Unless she appeared at a hearing with proof of remediation status and operational compliance, the nonprofit could lose its protected standing. If that happened, the owner could begin the process of permanent asset transfer. Date? I asked. 48 hours. Tessa swore under her breath and started pacing. Evelyn just stood there, arms folded tightly, the way people stand when they're holding themselves together by force. I looked from the message to the packet on my table, then to the wet gray light over the harbor. 3 days earlier, she'd shown up at my door needing a dry place to stand. Now we had a clock running, a staged closure, targeted records, and a shell contractor tied to rushed seizures. I folded the notice once and handed the phone back. Then we stop reacting, I said. We build a plan. Evelyn met my eyes. Tired as she was, there was something steadier in her expression now. Not relief. Not trust all the way yet. But the beginning of it. And in my line of work, that was usually the point where salvage started. That wasn't a sentence I ever expected to apply to Evelyn Hart, and honestly, not to me either. I'm not built for dramatic moves. I'm built for planning, for load paths, for moisture maps, for knowing which wall can come down and which one keeps the whole roof from folding. But the compliance hearing was coming fast, and by then we knew two things for sure: the official closure didn't make sense, and somebody had gone after very specific files. So we stopped talking about whether it was a bad idea and started figuring out how to do it without getting trapped. The service access route came back to me while I was looking over the old renovation sketches in my head. During the spring job at the center, I'd worked around a delivery corridor at the rear of the building, a narrow run between the old utility room and a storage alcove nobody used except for extra chairs and broken shelving. The outer latch had been unreliable even then. If the closure crew focused on the main entrances, there was a chance that side route had been treated like an afterthought. At 11:30, Tessa and I left the boathouse in my work truck with the lights off until we cleared the waterfront road. Evelyn stayed behind with 2 phones, a legal pad, and a story ready in case either of us got stopped. She hated not coming with us. I could tell by the way she stood beside the passenger door before we left, arms folded tight, trying to look like she was just reviewing details. 10 minutes without a check-in, I start calling, she said. 15, I told her. Nolan. Fine. 10. Tessa was quiet until we turned onto the block behind the center. Then she looked at me and said, "You know, for somebody who keeps pretending this is just logistics, you sound a lot like a person who cares." I kept my eyes on the alley. I care that people don't get steamrolled by bad paperwork. She gave me a look that said she didn't buy that whole answer, but she let it go. The rear service door was exactly where I remembered it, tucked beneath a rusted exterior stair and half hidden by plastic bins the closure crew had shoved aside. The padlock hanging on it looked official from a distance. Up close, it was cheap hardware clipped through an older hasp that had never been fully replaced. I checked the frame, the hinges, the strike. "This isn't real perimeter control," I muttered. Tessa stood under the awning, hood up, watching the alley mouth. "That's becoming your version of romance, by the way." I looked at her. "Just open the door," she said. It took less than a minute. Inside, the building smelled wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Staged wrong. Real containment jobs have a pattern to them too: active air movement, sealed transitions, equipment noise, tagged materials, visible control zones. This place had warning signs, plastic sheeting, and just enough props to scare off anyone who didn't know better. One corridor was draped in barrier film, but the tape lines were sloppy. A supposed restricted room had dust tracked straight through it. Half the machines positioned near the counseling wing weren't even plugged in. I took pictures of everything. Containment gaps. Wrong placement. Inactive units. Open seams. I shot wide angles first, then detail images with timestamps visible on my screen. Tessa moved with a speed that told me she'd been rehearsing this in her head for days. The offices hit hardest weren't random. Tenant advocacy was nearly stripped. Donor compliance cabinets were open. Patient relocation files were missing from 2-drawer units, though the rest of the paper in those rooms had been left scattered like the mess itself was supposed to tell a story. It didn't. It told too neat a story. Somebody had touched what mattered and left everything else as cover. "Here," Tessa whispered from the deputy office corridor. Behind a low shelf panel, taped beneath the underside of a side credenza, was a backup drive in a slim gray case. She pulled it free like she'd expected exactly where it would be. "You knew about that?" "No," she said. "But Evelyn hides important things where nobody dramatic would look." I almost answered that this was the first encouraging thing I'd heard all night, but footsteps cut across the lobby. Not loud. Not close. But enough. Tessa froze. I killed my flashlight and pulled her into the shadow of the records room doorway. A wash of white beam slid across the hall from the front corridor, then vanished. Voices followed, muffled by distance. Security or the closure team, maybe both. I could make out one laugh, one irritated answer, the scrape of something rolling across tile. We waited without speaking. When the sound moved toward the main stairwell, Tessa leaned in and whispered, "We should go." Then I saw movement through the wired glass of the administrative wing. A woman crossed from the conference room toward the deputy office, carrying a site badge on a lanyard and talking easily with one of the men from the front hall. I recognized her a second later from photos on the center's website and from Evelyn mentioning her name twice in the last 2 days. Daniel Cross's counterpart. Evelyn's deputy director. Marissa Bell. Not cornered. Not forced. Walking with them like she belonged there. I felt something cold settle into place. Back at the boathouse, Evelyn opened the side door before we even knocked. She'd been waiting in her coat, fully dressed, like sitting down had never really been an option. Tessa handed her the drive first. I passed over my phone and let her scroll through the images. At first she focused on the evidence. The fake barriers. The untouched dust lines. The stripped offices. Then she stopped on one frame and went still. "That's Marissa," she said. Nobody answered. The look on Evelyn's face wasn't shock exactly. Shock is clean. This was worse. It was the look of somebody watching the floor under a trusted room give way one board at a time. By dawn we had enough to prove the closure was theater. And enough to understand it had never just been about forcing her out. They were after older zoning appeals, internal complaints, relocation records, and anything tied to the nursing facility project buried under the redevelopment plan. This wasn't only a land grab. It was a sweep. Somebody wanted the past boxed up and made unreachable before anyone could connect it to patients, tenants, and public money. That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. Until then, I'd been helping Evelyn survive a bad situation. Now I knew we were standing inside something much bigger, and somebody she had trusted had already been helping them build it. It began with Evelyn doing exactly what she always did when something ugly showed its face. She tried to handle it through the proper channels first. No dramatic hallway scene. No furious call with raised voices. She sent a formal request for clarification to Marissa and Daniel, attached a narrow set of questions about access logs, site authority, and chain of custody for the seized records, then copied board counsel and 2 compliance contacts. By noon, Daniel had already turned it around. I wasn't in the room when Evelyn read his reply, but I knew the second she lowered her phone that something had landed hard. She didn't sit. She just stood by my workbench, one hand resting on the edge, eyes fixed on nothing. "What did he say?" I asked. Tessa answered before she could. That Evelyn's judgment has been compromised by stress. That she made unilateral decisions during the shutdown. That bringing in an outside contractor, she pointed at me, blurred boundaries and raised concern about improper influence. I let that sit for a second. Improper influence, I repeated. Evelyn finally looked at me. "He's building a case that I'm unstable." "He's building a story," I said. Different thing. But stories move fast when enough people want the easy version. By mid-afternoon, donors who had sounded worried the day before now sounded careful. One board member who'd promised to call back never did. Another sent a message saying she hoped everyone involved would prioritize the center over personal conflict. Staff who had been openly loyal started speaking in clipped, measured tones, like every sentence might be repeated somewhere else. Then came the money rumor. Not a formal accusation. Not yet. Just whispers that funds had been used improperly during the closure scramble. That expenses were missing support. That maybe Evelyn had overstepped trying to hold the place together. It was the kind of poison that works because it never arrives cleanly. It just appears in enough rooms that people begin stepping back before they even know why. Tessa slammed her notebook shut so hard a pen rolled onto the floor. They're not even trying to make this believable. They don't have to, Evelyn said. That was the first time her voice sounded truly tired. Not overwhelmed. Not angry. Tired in a deeper way, like she had seen this pattern before and hated that it still worked. An hour later, the next hit landed on Tessa. Someone flagged her copied server logs as unauthorized data access. Suddenly she wasn't the niece who had helped keep track of intake files and after-hour support lists. She was the easiest person in the picture to frame as reckless. Young, close to the center, close to Evelyn, technically not protected by the same standing. A neat scapegoat. Tessa read the notice twice and laughed once, sharp and humorless. So now I'm the problem too. You're not, Evelyn said. No, but I'm useful. She stood and started pacing the length of the curtain wall I'd built them on that first morning. That's what this is. They can't push you out cleanly, so they make you radioactive. Then they make me disposable. I wanted to tell her we should put everything out right then. The photos. The backup drive. The fake containment setup. The shell subcontractor. Burn the whole thing into daylight before they had more time to shape it. So I said exactly that. Evelyn turned toward me so fast the stool beside the bench scraped concrete. And then what? Then they scramble. No. Then they bury us under procedure. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, but her eyes were steady. You think truth wins because it exists. It doesn't. Not in rooms built to slow it down. I took a step closer. And you think waiting helps? I think moving too early gets people crushed. There it was. The split between us, finally out where neither of us could pretend it wasn't there. To me, pressure meant reinforce the weak point and hit back before the frame gave way. To Evelyn, pressure meant every wrong move could bring the whole structure down on the people still standing inside it. Neither of us was fully wrong, which somehow made it worse. Tessa looked between us and muttered, "Great. Exactly what we needed." I went out to the loading bay and stayed there longer than I needed to, checking tie-down straps that didn't need checking, res-tacking drying mats that were already square. Harbor wind pushed through the cracked side panel, carrying that cold wet smell of rope, salt, and rusted steel. Usually that smell settled me. Not that day. When I came back in, I found one of my own notices on the table. City Permit Review. My boathouse. Temporary occupancy, mixed-use compliance, waterfront operational variance. A list of bland phrases that all meant the same thing. Somebody had reached into my life now too. Tessa read over my shoulder. They moved fast. Too fast for random, I said. Evelyn closed her eyes for half a second. I'm sorry. That did something to me I didn't like. Not because I blamed her. Because part of me understood, right then, that the line was gone. Helping her was no longer some contained act of decency that ended when the storm did. I was inside it now. The old version of my life, the quiet one with fixed walls and predictable hours, wasn't waiting for me on the other side of this. That night, nobody ate much. Rain tapped lightly against the upper windows, nothing like the storm that brought them to me, but enough to keep the room sounding closed in. Evelyn sat at the edge of the cot behind the partition, shoulders bent, hands linked so tightly I could see the strain in her wrists. Tessa had gone silent, which was somehow worse than her pacing. Finally Evelyn said, almost to herself, maybe I should step aside. I looked over. No. She didn't raise her head. If I resign, some of this may stop falling on the staff. It won't stop, Tessa said from the other side of the room. It just gets easier for them. Evelyn gave a tired, sad kind of smile. Or maybe I'm the point of impact. Maybe once I'm gone, the rest can survive. I knew buildings too well to let that pass. Sometimes a wall looks like the problem because all the pressure marks show there. But take it out, and you find out it was the only thing keeping the load from crushing everything behind it. I leaned against the work table and looked at her across the dim light and hanging curtain panels. For the first time since she came through my door, Evelyn Hart looked like a woman considering surrender, not because she believed she was beaten, but because she could still imagine sacrificing herself to keep everybody else standing. And that was the lowest point yet, because I could see she meant it. There isn't anywhere to disappear in my place. You can turn your back, you can move to the loading bay, you can make a lot of noise with tools you don't actually need, but you still feel the other people in the room. Their footsteps. The pause before someone answers a call. The weight of what hasn't been said. Evelyn stayed behind the partition most of that morning, working through messages with a voice so steady nobody on the other end could have guessed she had almost talked herself into stepping down the night before. Tessa sat at the main bench with her laptop and 2 chargers plugged into the same strip, chewing the inside of her cheek while she sorted through the backup drive and the exported logs again. I kept busy because that's what I do when the air gets too tight. I rebuilt a warped cabinet face for a client in Fells Point. I swapped out bearings in one of my older air movers. I reorganized a shelf that didn't need reorganizing. None of it changed the fact that every time I looked toward the curtain wall, I knew the real problem was still standing there. It finally broke around dusk. The rain had come back, not hard, just steady enough to blur the harbor lights. Tessa was at the far end of the room muttering over a chain of messages she had been trying to reconstruct from cached files. Evelyn stepped out from behind the partition with her coat on but nowhere to go, which told me she needed movement more than air. We can't keep doing this, she said. I set down the wrench in my hand. No. For a second neither of us moved. Then she crossed the floor and stopped on the other side of the work table. I wasn't trying to push you away, she said. I was trying to keep the damage contained. That sounds familiar. A tired smile touched her mouth and vanished. I know. She looked down at the scarred wood between us. I've spent years taking every hit quietly because I thought that was leadership. Keep everyone else upright. Absorb the pressure. Never let anyone see where the frame is weak. And now I can see how easy that made me to isolate. I leaned against the table. Harbor water knocked softly under the floor beams. My version isn't better. I build walls. I fix the physical thing in front of me and tell myself that's enough. Stay useful, stay detached, stay out of the public mess. Her eyes came up to meet mine. But you didn't stay out. No. I let out a breath. And maybe that's what's been bothering me. Not that they reached my place. That they were always going to reach it once I stopped pretending none of this was mine. The room went quiet in a different way then. Not the strained kind. Something clearer. Behind us, Tessa made a sharp sound. Hold on. We turned. She was already pulling the laptop closer, one hand flying over the trackpad. I found a linked thread. Her voice had changed, gone bright and focused. Not in the center system. In the backup sync from an external consultant folder. She opened a string of messages, then another. Dates. Time stamps. Names from the redevelopment consulting group. 2 city compliance addresses. 1 planning aid copied in before the emergency closure was ever issued. Evelyn stepped beside her so fast the rolling stool spun away. That's before the inspection order. By 4 days, Tessa said. They were already talking about timing the site access and messaging language before the hazard even existed on paper. That was the first piece I'd seen that didn't just suggest manipulation. It showed design. Tessa kept digging. There's more. One of the consultant attachments references board transition expectations. They thought Evelyn would resign cleanly once the building was locked down. Evelyn went very still. A month earlier, maybe even a week earlier, that line might have flattened her. Instead she straightened and said, then they built the story around me surrendering. Which means we break it in public, I said. She looked at me, and this time there was no split between caution and force. Just calculation. Partnership. By 9 that night we had the outline of a real plan. Tessa reached out to a former center client named Lena Ortiz, now a producer at a local investigative outlet. Lena answered on the second try, listened for 6 minutes, and said she'd help if we gave her something that could survive daylight and cross-checking. Not emotion. Structure. That part, finally, was mine. I cleared the main table and started laying out the materials I'd gathered since the first night. Printed photos from the staged closure. Site sketches from my renovation work. Notes on containment failures. Sequence maps showing what real emergency setup should look like against what had actually been done. I pulled damaged barrier film from my training stock, wrong filters from an old unit, and tagged samples to show how the setup at the center had been built to look serious without functioning like any real response zone. Tessa watched me line everything up and said, "You're building a case the way other people build furniture." "I'm building something a room can understand," I said. Evelyn stood on the opposite side of the table, sleeves pushed up, reading through the message chain again. Legal filing first. Then Lena's coverage time to the board session. Then resident testimony. Then your demonstration. I looked at her. And you? She held my gaze for a second that felt longer than it was. I'm done asking to be protected from my own fight. There was no speech after that. No dramatic moment. She just moved beside me and started sorting exhibits into order while Tessa built the timeline on the laptop. That was the shift. Not me saving her. Not her leaning on me because the storm had left her nowhere else to stand. This was something steadier. Chosen. She wasn't asking for shelter anymore. She was asking me to stand next to her when the room turned hostile. And for the first time since she came through my door, that felt less like a crisis and more like the beginning of the life neither of us had planned for, but both of us were finally willing to claim. The board meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 6th floor of a downtown office building that smelled like polished stone and expensive coffee. The kind of place built to make ugly decisions feel clean. I got there early with 2 rolling cases and a flat presentation board wrapped in a moving blanket. Tessa came in with her laptop bag, 2 backup drives, and the tight, focused look she wore when she was too wired to be afraid. Evelyn arrived last, not rushed, not dramatic, just composed in a navy coat with her hair pinned back and a folder tucked under one arm. She looked like herself again. Not the exhausted woman who had shown up at my storm door soaked through and carrying her whole life in 2 bags. This was Evelyn Hart as the room knew her. Steady. Precise. Impossible to rattle if you didn't know where to look. Only I did know where to look by then. I saw the extra breath she took before we walked in. I saw how her hand brushed once against the folder edge, grounding herself. She caught me noticing, and for a second her eyes met mine. Not asking to be saved. Just making sure I was there. Daniel was already inside with 2 property representatives, 1 attorney, and 3 board members who wore concern like a uniform. Marissa sat near the far end of the table, expression carefully neutral, as if she had somehow wandered into the wrong meeting by accident. The city compliance officer called the room to order, and Daniel began exactly the way I knew he would. Not with facts. With framing. He spoke in that smooth administrative tone people use when they want a takedown to sound responsible. Evelyn, he said, had made a series of unstable leadership choices during a difficult operational event. Her judgment had become impaired by pressure. Her refusal to cooperate with the remediation process had placed the organization at risk. Outside influence had worsened matters. That last part came with a brief glance in my direction, just enough to remind the room I was the contractor in work boots standing beside the woman they were trying to recast as a problem. He thought he had the story locked. Then Evelyn stood. She didn't defend herself first. That was what changed the air in the room. She didn't rush to deny, soften, or plead. She opened her folder, placed 3 copies of a timeline on the table for counsel and the compliance officer, and began dismantling the sequence piece by piece. She walked them through the after-hours access records, the pre-closure site activity, the missing chain of custody process for internal files, the selective stripping of rooms tied to relocation, donor oversight, and zoning objections. Every point was anchored to time, to names, to records they hadn't expected her to hold. Daniel interrupted twice. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She just answered him more narrowly each time until the interruption itself started making him look nervous. Then Tessa took over. She connected her laptop to the room's screen with hands that were steady now, even if they hadn't been the night before. She pulled up the exported server logs, then the consultant message chain, then the time-stamped exchanges showing redevelopment staff and compliance contacts discussing access, timing, and messaging days before the official hazard existed on paper. One of the board members leaned forward. "Are these authenticated?" Tessa looked right back at him. "They are preserved in original export format, duplicated across media, and already provided to counsel this morning." That was the moment Daniel's posture changed. Not much. A shoulder tightening. His jaw setting harder. But I saw it. He had expected panic, not preparation. Then it was my turn. I rolled my first case to the open side of the room and set the materials on the conference table one by one. Barrier film. Filter tags. Printed site photos. A simple layout board showing how real emergency containment is built compared to the staged setup inside the center. I kept it plain because plain lands harder. "This is what a real response zone requires," I said, pointing to the sequence map. "Controlled entry, active air movement, sealed transitions, equipment placement that matches the declared condition, and a traceable handling process for anything removed from the site." Then I pointed to the enlarged photos from the center. Here's what they actually had. Inactive units. False barriers. Contamination lines that would fail in minutes. Restricted rooms with tracked dust crossing through them. Setups built to look serious from the hallway without functioning under even basic review. Nobody interrupted me. That was the part one had built for. Rooms like that trust plain evidence more than outrage. I gave them no speech, no flourish, just enough truth arranged so they could no longer hide from what they were seeing. Then phones began vibrating around the table. One. Then another. Then a third. Lena. Tessa didn't smile, but I saw the corner of her mouth move. The producer had released the piece at exactly the right moment. Not a dramatic exposé, just corroborated reporting already live, with supporting interviews from displaced residents, public filing references, and confirmation that external review requests had been submitted before the meeting started. Suddenly this wasn't a contained internal dispute anymore. It had witnesses. The property attorney whispered something to one of the representatives. Marissa looked down at the table. Daniel tried one last pivot, claiming he had trusted outside consultants and knew nothing about any coordinated seizure of records. Evelyn slid one final set of pages across the table. Payment records. Messages. His contact chain. Not vague association. Direct connection. For the first time that morning, he had no smooth answer ready. The compliance officer requested a recess. One board member refused to grant it until the asset transfer motion was suspended on record. Another asked for immediate outside review. The property group's confidence cracked all at once, the way rotten trim looks solid until you press one finger through the paint and the whole surface gives. By the time the meeting ended, the transfer was halted. External review was called. Daniel was no longer speaking like the room belonged to him. Outside, in the long hallway beyond the conference room, Evelyn stopped walking. For 1 second the whole morning seemed to catch up with her. Not enough to break her. Just enough to make her close her eyes and breathe. When she opened them again, she turned to me. "We did it," she said quietly. "Not I. Not you. We." And standing there with the city spread out gray beyond the glass, Tessa already fielding calls beside us, I realized the real victory wasn't only that the lie had collapsed in public. It was that they had built their whole plan around Evelyn being isolated and me staying invisible. And in the end, the one thing they never accounted for was us standing in the same room, refusing to play the parts they had written for us. A few weeks later, the place beside my boathouse stopped looking like overflow space and started looking like a future. The old center was still tied up in review, hearings, and enough official language to make a simple answer impossible. Evelyn could have spent months waiting for somebody in a suit to decide when she was allowed to build again. That was never really her style, even if it had taken this whole mess to prove it. Instead, she moved. There was an unused warehouse section 2 lots down from my operation, part of an old waterfront storage building with high ceilings, cracked loading concrete, and just enough structural sense left in it to be worth saving. Most people would have seen drafty walls, bad lighting, and years of neglect. I saw workable bones. Evelyn saw room for a clinic desk, intake tables, private consult corners, and shelves for emergency supplies that could be rolled out instead of trapped behind one address. By the second week, we had staff volunteers painting, donated folding furniture arriving in mismatched batches, and a coffee maker running almost constantly on a temporary counter built from reclaimed maple I had salvaged from a townhouse library. Tessa became the center of the whole operation before anyone officially said so. At the old building, she'd been treated like the youngest person in the room, useful but easy to overlook. Here, nobody had the luxury of overlooking her. She ran schedules, tracked inventory, coordinated calls, and somehow knew where every charger, every label maker, every missing set of keys had gone. I'd walk in from the workshop carrying conduit or wall brackets, and she'd point without looking up. Supplies there. Volunteers in the rear bay. Evelyn skipped lunch again. Some roles get assigned. Others get revealed. This one got revealed. My own work changed too, though not in the way I would have admitted a month earlier. I still did restoration. Still took the flood jobs, the smoke-damaged kitchens, the split-pipe basements, the ruined flooring and swollen trim and all the rest of the things people called me for after a place went bad. But now, between those jobs, I started getting calls about prevention. Small property owners. Community spaces. Old church offices. People asking how to make a building harder to push around in a crisis. Better storage. Cleaner access plans. Backup power for records. Physical layouts that kept one bad actor from controlling everything with a lock and a printed notice. Turns out once you stop thinking of yourself as the man who shows up after damage, you start seeing how much can be done before it. That shift was Evelyn's fault, though I never said it that way. What surprised me most was how natural the rest of it became. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Just steadily, quietly real. She had a folding desk in the new space, but somehow her mug kept ending up beside my workbench. My extra extension cords disappeared into her intake stations and came back labeled in Tessa's handwriting. We stopped asking whose coffee beans were whose. Stopped pretending our schedules were separate when every day ended with both of us standing in the same half-finished room deciding what got built next. One evening, after most of the volunteers had gone and the warehouse had that tired, active silence a place gets after useful work, I found Evelyn at the far end of the floor studying the frame wall we just finished around a consultation area. The sunset was coming through the upper windows in long copper bands. Dust hung in the light. Somewhere behind us, Tessa was arguing with a supplier over missing casters for rolling cabinets. Evelyn glanced at me. "You know what I like about this place?" "What?" "If somebody tries to corner us again, they'll have a harder time finding the walls." I looked around. Open sight lines. Mobile stations. Record storage built in locked rolling units instead of one trapped back office. Utility lines routed where they could be shut off in sections instead of all at once. Nothing fancy. Just smarter. "You designed it that way," I said. "We designed it that way." There was that word again. We. She walked toward the main table, picked up a thin folder, and slid it across to me. I opened it and found lease language, operating terms, and a development agreement draft with both our names on it. I looked up. "What is this?" Her expression didn't waver. "Cotenancy. Shared development rights on this section. Formal, not temporary." I read the first page again even though I'd already understood it. Most people think the big moment in a life like this is some speech, some perfect line, some dramatic promise. It isn't. Sometimes it's paperwork placed on a work table in a half-finished warehouse while sawdust still hangs in the air. "You're serious," I said. "Yes. This ties you to me." A small smile touched her mouth. "Nolan, that has been true for a while." For once, I had nothing practical to say. Behind us, the new center was still rough. Unpainted sections. Exposed brackets. Boxes not yet unpacked. But it was alive. Phones charging. Lights on. Real people already coming through for help. Not someday. Now. I signed. Later, when the evening settled and the last volunteer headed out, we stood near the open bay door looking back into the unfinished, active space. Tessa was inside at a folding table, building tomorrow's schedule with the kind of focus that meant she'd probably still be there in an hour. Staff moved through the room